Funny, whenever the ATO speak, people leave the room. It's good to be here without a protective cage, by the way, which is often a risk. But in all seriousness, actually in the role that I perform, I have a lot of friends in industry because what I do in Phoenix is designed largely to help people from being ripped off by what are effectively criminals who not only abuse the labour that they use, but they also create an uneconomic level playing field where people who want to do the right thing are put at a cost disadvantage to those who do want to do the right thing. So it's a space where we do have a lot of friends, both in the private sector and in government. I'm not here to assess anyone's tax returns or poke sticks on anybody, but largely to try and collaborate to deal with a bigger problem that we see as a big issue for the tax system. So today I'm hoping to enlighten you to the story around Phoenix behaviour, which is a big problem for the economy and an all too common narrative in the agricultural sector where labour hire firms are concerned. Given the relatively short time frame, I'll go through an overview of Phoenix behaviour for those of you who don't understand the typology, show you how Phoenix behaviour plays out among labour hire firms operating in the agri-sector, give you some ideas around what the warning signs might be of Phoenix behaviour and what you can do to prevent it. There's no specific definition in any act or regulation about what Phoenix activity is, and it plays out differently for different agencies. So, for example, with ASIC, it's about breach of company directors' obligations. For the Offices of State Revenue, it's about non-payment of payroll taxes. For Fair Work Ombudsman, it's about underpayment of wages. The definition that I prefer to use, because of the way I approach Phoenix, is it's the evasion of creditor liabilities through the deliberate and systematic liquidation or abandonment of corporate trading entities. For the uninitiated, Phoenix plays out when a labour hire company will build up creditor obligations over time, and that can be a short time. The assets of the company are transferred by the company's controllers to a new second company, with the consequence that the creditors of the old company can't be paid. The old company is then placed into liquidation or abandoned, leaving the creditors of the old company with very little chance of recovering what they're owed. The business of the old company then rises again in the new company under the same control and often using a similar name, hence the mythological Phoenix. Now, we as a regulator, and this is really important, we have to recognise that Phoenixing behaviour occurs along a continuum, okay? That is, not all Phoenix activity is necessarily illegal or fraudulent. And that's really important because we want to make sure that we're knocking on the doors of the right people or kicking the doors of the right people down before we actually make judgment on people's behaviour. Now, it might occur as a result of commercial circumstances involving bad business decisions or simply bad luck. It can occur because it's an opportunistic solution to a short-term problem where the controller of the company is looking at Phoenix as a way of saving a buck as opposed to a way of potentially making a buck. And that might play out, for example, where a manufacturer's got an issue with a warranty claim, they don't want to honour the warranties. It could be as a result of a court order over a workplace harassment issue. Sometimes these guys will take this approach to dealing with it. And often what happens over time is the harm that they cause gets lost on the operator, and they move into this space where basically Phoenix activity becomes deliberate and that the structuring of a Phoenix is planned before a company is even incorporated. So they know exactly what they're going to do, they know exactly who they're going to rip off, they know exactly the structure they're going to use, which legal advisors and accountants they're going to use, and they'll execute it with a deliberate intent to take other people's money. Unfortunately, what happens at the right-hand end is a big problem in the agricultural industry involving labour hire. It's not to say that labour hire firms generally are a problem, but there are certain networks of operators in most of the major growing areas and meat-packing sites around Australia where Phoenix operators are a real problem and they cost us several $100 million a year. Worse for the economy still. Now, Phoenix behaviour is more prevalent on short-term projects because the money the company earns comes in and can be extracted and the company liquidated or abandoned within one reporting cycle. The companies typically hold few assets. Now, that's a common typology in the agri sector because the harvesting seasons are usually relatively short, and the only labour that the companies have is generally the only assets the company has are their access to labour. The kinds of industries where we see Phoenix play out: car dealerships, manufacturing, cafes, even real estate agents. Meat processing is a big problem area, fruit and vegetable picking. And it may come as no surprise that 72% of the Phoenix population that we have under our radar screen have a connection to property and construction. But even within property and construction, labour hire is still an issue because it's the labour hire companies who are supplying the workers on the sites, for example, concrete pouring, that are the subject of the Phoenixing events. Now, it may come as a surprise that the cost of Phoenix activity as quantified by PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2012 was between $1.8 and $3.2 billion annually. There's been an update to that research, and we expect that number is going to be somewhat higher. But importantly, the story of Phoenix is not just about tax. It's about workers losing their entitlements. It's about the failure of creditors, suppliers of Phoenix companies, and often we see tragic consequences where basically businesses go to the wall, families break up, people commit suicide as a result of the behaviour of Phoenix operators. Workers' rights are often abused, and we know from our colleagues at Safe Work Australia and the state regulators that Phoenix behaviour goes hand in hand with worker exploitation, underpayment and the underinsurance of workers. There's been quite a few public examples you may be aware of where this has played out, and it's got plenty of media airtime. The social welfare system is left to support those who are left financially stranded by Phoenix. So it's another cost to government through the unemployment benefits and other benefits the government provides. Revenue for the community is diminished, which would otherwise go into services. And importantly, Phoenix behaviour facilitates cut price tendering, where the lower price tender just reflects the rip-off of suppliers, the rip-off of workers, and the rip-off of the community's revenue. So Phoenix results in people who want to play on a level playing field being left out in the cold and out of work. And although we might not realise it, Phoenixing is a behaviour that actually affects us all, either directly or indirectly. Okay. As I said, most labour hire firms in the fruit and vegetable harvesting industry are doing the right thing, but there's a chunk of them who aren't, and it's a big problem, and we can't really ignore it. Now, in explaining how Phoenix activity plays out in your industry, I'll just go through a basic typology, which I'm sure you all understand. Then I'll move on to how it's supposed to play out in the context of the payments of tax, and then I'll go through what actually happens with regards to tax. So in a typical business as usual situation, the grower engages a company under a contract. That company is under the control of an individual who has access to, quite often, as you all know, a pool of non-resident workers of different visa types and the like, and others who are interested in seasonal work. And they're engaged to pick the vegetables, which ultimately end up providing the grower with an income. So how is it supposed to play out for tax? Now, there are three tax issues that are largely involved in this space, and that's primarily pay-as-you-go withholding, which is the amount, for those who don't know, you have to withhold from an employee's wages every fortnight and remit through BAS. Different company sizes produce different results in that space. Goods and services tax plays out with regards to the payment from the grower to the labour hire company, and there is also income tax that's paid on the profit that's made by the operator. So in this situation, what will actually happen? So if one takes the example where the grower has paid the labour hire company $11,000 for labour. Of that $11,000, $7,000 is used to pay the wages of the non-residents. So for tax purposes, what will happen is that the non-resident workers will receive net cash of $4,725, and that's an odd number, but you'll see in a moment, and they're required to withhold pay-as-you-go of $2,275. That's basically saying that for every dollar earned, the labour hire operator is required to withhold 32.5% of the amount that they pay, which ties into those numbers. In addition, $1,000 of GST is payable on that transaction, so it's an $11,000 taxable supply, which is 1/11 of the 11,000. And if one takes the GST exclusive amount of $10,000 less the $7,000 wage cost, the income tax on that will be $900 or 30% of $3,000. So the amount that gets remitted to the ATO from that transaction is $4,175, okay? What actually happens is pretty much this. At GST of $1,000 and the $2,275, the total $4,125, simply gets put into the labour hire operator's pocket. He just walks away from it. So you might think he's holding back and for his workers' wages, doing the right thing, but more often than not, unfortunately, you find too many situations where they're not. So well, you pay the difference between what you get for your crop, the costs of planting and raising and harvesting it. He pays absolutely nothing and walks away quite wealthy, as we've seen in some situations. The typology for labour hire in the fruit and vegetable harvesting industry probably described as follows. Simply, it's a wealth extraction strategy. All they're doing is embellishing themselves with the money that they owe other people. So the wealth that is extracted is sourced from by the Phoenix operator from the entitlements of the company's employees, the company's suppliers, and the tax system. In your industry, Phoenix activity occurs very quickly. As I said before, it lends itself nicely to it because it moves so quickly. Regulators can't get on top of it before it's happened. It involves the use of straw directors. This is quite a common scenario where the people you're actually dealing with don't actually control the companies, well, legally, that are being used to conduct the harvesting operation. So they use what's called straw directors, which is basically sometimes it's a family member, sometimes it's an associate or someone they've paid to be appointed as a director. And the reason they do that is they want to avoid the criminal sanctions that come with and obligations that come with being a director of a company that engages in bad behaviour. It's quite common for disqualified directors to appoint family members to do this sort of thing, but generally, when the family member gets a criminal sanction brought against them, it doesn't make for very pleasant dinner party conversations at Christmas. Phoenix operators from foreign backgrounds will often use different variations of their name to conceal their identity, and so in some communities you can have 6 or 7 different variations of a name, and that allows them to create confusion about who's actually controlling the company. You may also note that a backpacker who may have been picking vegetables on your property 2 years ago or 3 years ago is now the director of the company that's been contracted to pick this year. Problem is that backpacker's left the country 18 months, 2 years ago, and the operator's just using his details to appoint as a director. Often what they'll also do is they'll actually use the tax file numbers that they get from the backpackers, and they'll lodge tax returns with them, with refunds. So that, then it becomes cyclical. We've got guys who have literally had thousands of returns that have been lodged fraudulently with claims in every single one of them that relate to people who have not been in the country for years. Okay, so that's a sort of a subset of their behaviour. Another issue we see is underinsurance of workers and many examples of worker exploitation. Now, one thing that's really important here is you've got to be aware of the risks that are imposed upon the farmer or the grower in this situation, because you may have a primary duty of care under the Occupational Health and Safety Acts. So if you're able to control or influence the way work is done on your farm, you have an obligation to protect the health and safety of the people who are carrying out the work. So, albeit that you might think that the labour hire operator actually has that obligation, he doesn't. He might have part of it, but you might have part of it as well. Now, there's a thing called accessorial liability that exists under the Fair Work Act as well, which basically means that if the labour hire operator is ripping off his employees, and they, or his backpackers, if you want to call them that, and you're aware of it or you're complicit in it, then you could be subject to penalties and compensation as a result of that behaviour. So the warning signs of Phoenix behaviour. Okay. This is really important for us that you actually see the signs of behaviour of Phoenix operators, so you can take steps to make decisions about whether you want to work with them or not. And look at each of them as a collective as opposed to anything individually telling you there's a problem. Different season, different company. So typically, you may be dealing with the same guy, year in, year out. He calls you up, you've got a trusted relationship with him. But my question is often, well, is the company that is using the same company he was using last year or last picking season? It's a good sign if the company is consistent from year to year to year, because it's showing that party is more likely to be complying with their obligations and doing the right thing, and hasn't got a concern because that legal entity that they're operating in is being used on an ongoing basis. The controller is not the director of the company, so the guy you're talking to purports to control everything that's been going on is not actually a director of the company that you've actually contracted with to supply you the labour. Always good to check that, and I'll give you some conduits for that in a moment. Another way to work out whether there's a problem is whether the control has been associated with histories of liquidations and deregistrations. And that's often a red flag to say that there's a recidivist behaviour occurring where the person behind the company is involved in rip-offs of his workers, suppliers and the tax system. Now, if you're interested in actually finding out where you can evaluate any of the above, that's the ASIC website line. It will help you understand the lists of directors, whether individuals have been disqualified as directors historically, and also from the Australian Business Register, which helps you understand whether they've been registered for tax purposes. Other warning signs of Phoenix behaviour include a preference to using cash. There's no problem using cash. There's nothing illegal about using cash, but often it's an indicator of people's motivations when they insist on using cash. Other good point to note is that the regional banks have become a really good source of intelligence for us, because they're very concerned about the amount of cash that is going through small country towns in regional centres. When you go into some of those branches, you see people that 62-year-old lady, 17-year-old guy in that branch. High security risk. Banks don't like the idea because they know who these guys are connected with, that their employees are in danger at times, and when they see problematic instances, they tend to inform us of that. Lodgement's not up to date. GST registrations, evidence of lodgement and payment are really, really good information sources to prove that the people that you're dealing with are complying, or the companies that you're dealing with are complying. And no one's under an obligation to provide you with that. And often I look at this from a bit of a sniff test. Ask the question about whether they want to provide it, and it really goes to what the reaction that you get is. If the reaction is passive and I'm happy to provide it to you, or I don't really need to provide it to you, versus aggressive, it might tell you a story about whether you're dealing with someone's high risk. Too cheap to be true, often is. As I said, we're concerned about, we get this situation where not only are we not dealing on an economic level playing field if this is allowed to persist, we're going to end up with a spiral to the bottom where everyone's undercutting each other, and more tax rip-offs, more worker rip-offs just to get a cost advantage. So they have to sort of stop it at some point in time, otherwise there's an abyss that we're going to go into and we're not going to be able to get out of it. Another one is, good indicator is the labour hire firm's response to ATO garnishees. A garnishee is basically where the ATO can send you a notice saying, instead of you paying that company your next payment, you have to send it to us, and you're compelled under law to send it to us. The strategy that the labour hire operators use to defeat that is effectively they'll just go to you and say, can you please pay that to another bank account or to another company name? So effectively just phoenixing mid-project in order to ensure the flow of their cash. That's a very powerful warning sign. Okay, so what can you do to combat phoenixing activity? Take note of all of the above and don't do business with phoenix operators would be my first instruction. One thing to recognise, and I hope I've highlighted with some points there, is that albeit that the phoenix operator might present a short-term saving, the question goes to whether or not you've got a medium-term to long-term cost. Certainly something that we play in other industry spaces, but questions around the reputation of your industry, around labour abuses, safety, having labour hire in the agri-industry identified as a haven for tax dodgers and other criminals, are clearly reputational issues that you don't want to be grappling with. So please do the basic governance checks and help us all deal with this. Okay, now I can't talk to that point. That point unfortunately became a policy issue yesterday, and because as my colleague from the ACCC spoke about earlier on, we're in what's called caretaker period. So as soon as there's a policy initiative becomes contentious, I can't talk about it anymore. But it was an interesting idea that was raised in my previous meetings with AusVeg. Okay, help us identify the fingerprints that are left behind by phoenix operators. As I said before, it moves really quickly, and it's hard to detect in real time, and we're always interested in understanding what we're missing. So one of the things that we encourage with our partner regulators is if they're doing their work around, for example, insurances for occupational health and safety, workers' compensation, and other registration processes that they have, that's a fingerprint that we can follow, and then we can try and tie together the people involved and actually take action against them. So we've got really excellent data sources at the ATO, and they are effective up to the point, but in this particular space, because of the speed at which it moves, sometimes the data lags the activity, and we can't actually get on top of them fast enough. Now, just one takeaway for you, well, probably the main takeaway is remember, phoenix activity has impacts that transcend more than just one grower, one crop, or 1 year. It affects your industry, it affects human lives, and the revenue that we all rely on for basic services. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to come along today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, subject to whether I'm able to answer them, but I'll genuinely try to do so.